history. Sorry for popping on. A little late there. I was already seeing the questions, and I was taking a quick look at Norma's question there. So I'll just say quickly hello, and then we can kind of get on with it. But yeah, I just thought I'd do an AMA this afternoon. Haven't done one in a little while. So I do one hang out, and whatever, people come, they don't. Yeah, so happy to answer any questions, anything like that. So fire away. So Norma already asked about British War Diaries from World War II. So end of April, May 45. I don't know the British ones as well. I just quickly checked the UK National Archive. It doesn't look like anything is digitized in that regard. So not going to come from them, unfortunately. There's First World War, but not Second, as I can see here, which is unfortunate. But makes sense given all the money that went into the centenary stuff for the First World War. But you can always poke around online. That's how I sometimes find them. And there's message boards and things like that that help with that. But off the top of my head, I don't know anywhere else. Nowhere like if the government institutions really do them that I know of. Maybe some of the smaller ones, but the big ones you can always check are well, the UK National Archive is one I always go to, and the Army Museum is another. It's also in London. Sometimes they have stuff that's digitized, but mostly not, just like everywhere else. So unfortunately, can't help you there, Norma, off the top of my head, but it doesn't hurt to poke around and see some of the old message boards out there. People might have answers for you because a lot of people are already looking for this stuff. So it's not anything, probably not anything new that people are asking. So hopefully it's out there somewhere. No, James, you can ask questions about whatever you want. There's never any restrictions or anything like that. Hey, everybody. Hello. Yeah, that's the one I was talking about, Rob talking about is World War. Well, WW talk. That's one I've had some success with. Sometimes it's not always a guarantee, but it's better than most, I find. And usually what the messages are old, so it's not like you can jump in there, but you can try a new one if necessary. But this stuff's been kicking around for a while, so it's usually somewhere. Yeah, Q, yeah. Oh, yes, and the IWM also has stuff sometimes. They are a bit weird with their collection online. Not always the best. In person, they're pretty good. You still have to pay. I don't know if you still have to pay that stupid copyright fee, but I had to pay that when I went years ago. That was dumb. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I haven't done much on theirs, document wise in a long time. Mostly photos and things like that because that's public domain. So that's usually what I might go to is all that good stuff. What's my favorite color? Blue, actually. Blue. I do enjoy good blue. First love is Vietnam War. Have you ever considered a live stream on Canadian individual participation and political involvement too? So we did one, I forget his name, unfortunately, off the top of my head. We had an author come on to talk about his book about this, about Canadian connection to Vietnam. That included both Canadians going across the border to enlist in the various U.S. armed forces, and as they're called at the time, draft dodgers, or coming up to Canada to escape the draft during the war, and some who stayed, some who never left. Quite a few. I mean, most of them went back, as far as we know, based on kind of stats. I think it was around 50,000. Funny, I think it's around 50,000 left the U.S. to escape the draft, but then 50,000 Canadians enlisted. So it kind of balanced itself out in a way, which is interesting in a sense. But I don't know too much about it. I could do some digging. It's not a big thing here. Sorry, my phone, of course, blows up as soon as I get on here. Yeah, it's not as big and there's not as much attention to it here. There's a few memorials in a couple places. Windsor, I believe. I think there's another one somewhere else. Cornwall, maybe. Ontario. But yeah, there's not much discussed in that regard, unfortunately. But I maybe I can find other authors talking about this stuff, but it's not one I know too much about. And the political involvement is, I mean, minor at best. They're in Canada's government's not involved. Canadian forces are technically not involved in the fighting. They're part of the peacekeeping operations, both after the French War ends and after, I guess you can call it, the American War ends as well. Canadians are involved in both of those peacekeeping operations. As we know, they don't go well. Canadian troops are involved in both of those. So yeah, that's a big part of it. But yeah, and then there's some fighting, political fighting, almost literal physical violence between Johnson and Prime Minister Pearson. Allegedly, he apparently picked up, because Johnson was a big man, apparently picked up Pearson and pinned him against a wall after, Pearson gave a somewhat famous speech, particularly at the time, about the limitations of bombing North Vietnam, things like that. And Johnson, is known as quite a temper. So he was not happy with Pearson for doing that in a public format at the time, right? So that was a big one. Not much else. There's, anti-war protests in Canada too. I don't know if the government in the U.S. was paying attention to them, probably not. But yeah, it's an interesting one, but it's just little bits and pieces. There's not a whole bunch going on there. But the book, I can link it afterwards, or I can take a look in a minute. But actually, I can see if I can pull it up and I can put it in the chat. It's more about the individual stories. And this was years ago. I forget the name of the individual, unfortunately. It just had so many people on. Sorry, one second. Yeah. Oh, John Boyko. Yeah. So this is the live stream we did here. Hopefully that works. But you can find it's a live stream from quite a while ago. It's talking about his book, and he interviewed a bunch of people who, draft dodgers and Canadians who fought and all that stuff. So you can check that out afterwards. It's pretty short, it's only an hour. So that's a good one. It's an interesting book for sure. But yeah, I don't know too much, and it would take me quite a bit of research to go doing that. So not too sure. Not that I know of. Not that I know of. Oh, that's a fascinating question. Area we kind of know about we talk about a bit on the channel and in various contexts and things like that. It's not my opinion about whether conscription's right or wrong. I don't tend to think about it that way because, it has to be done in the context of the time. I know people say that, but this is a case where that's true. And Second World War, it had to be done in Canada. After June 1940, right, there's literally a panic across the country of what to do. People don't expect France to fall like that. And they do this very quickly. There have been talk about it. There've been some preliminary work on doing it. So that it was fired off pretty quick. But I think King opposed for all his other faults and all that other stuff. And he was not the best person. And he was kooky beyond any sort of measure. He handled that well. They changed what was domestic duty a couple of times, right? They bumped it out in Greenland and Iceland. And then they also did it right for the Aleutian campaign as well. I think under the time it was not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, right? They sent some conscripts to Kiska. Luckily there's no battle, so it's not a big deal. I'm sure it would have become a huge hot potato had it been a bloody battle. I think I would have made the Hong Kong aftermath look like child's play in comparison, I think, to what happened. It may have been more parallel to the events of 1918 with, riots and big riots and death and things like that. But again, that's just speculation on my part. But I don't think it violated it in the sense of the word, because they could just change the law to whatever they wanted it to be, and that's what they did. They kept changing it. I don't think one of the big issues, and I can't remember how it played out, because my supervisor wrote on this for his work, his dissertation. He did a book on it. It's called Stepping Stones to Nowhere, Galen Paris. I can't remember where it came down, but there was a huge to-do over overseas pay for those who went to Kiska, because they were there for months, some of them, right? So I'm not sure how that came down, to be honest. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know that was a big deal of getting proper pay, or if they were ever given that overseas pay. I want to say no, but I could be wrong. Probably easily checkable if not while streaming, but yeah, it's a fascinating part. I think it was handled well overall. I mean, sending them to Kiska to kind of blood them was not the best idea. I don't think it was a great idea in that sense, because they didn't even really need to do that. They had lots of troops in Canada who were willing to go, and because they signed up for overseas duty, but they didn't do that. So, I mean, it's all a big what if, because it never happened, right? There's no battle. It's the battle that never was, as I like to call it. Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting one for sure. But yeah, they just changed the agreements and they changed the laws to fit whatever they wanted to do. Then they did that for the entirety of the National Resources Mobilization Act. That's the Conscription Act, and they changed it all the time because they could. So, I mean, it's more of a moral question, I guess, but I don't really come down on that because I don't think there's much value in it anymore. That's an excellent question. I don't know the German, because I know we've talked about this before. Yeah, as much as possible. I'm not sure about the German archives completely. I know they have some funky privacy laws. I mean, so do we here in Canada. So I don't know if it's too similar. I don't know. I haven't tried to do an individual service record there. Depends, I guess. But as much as you can, name, date of birth, I find is extremely helpful. Place of birth is also very helpful. Units served in sometimes helps, because usually you might be able to do a backdoor way of researching if there's some privacy legislation, speed bumps that I've had to deal with numerous times. There's usually sometimes a back way in, and you can find out some more details if you have more of those. But anything you got is a huge help. Service numbers especially are massive, but things like place of birth can help separate if there's similar names. Which, I mean, with the German forces, I'm sure there's a lot just because of the massive numbers, right? Canada, it's not something I deal with too much, but it is helpful. But again, I don't know the German laws. That's one I don't know. So unfortunately, I can't answer that. But I mean, as much as you got, even if it's like family lore or something, that's usually helpful because that can narrow down as well. Just from the research I've done, but that's mostly Canadian context. So I can only speak to that, but I know there's a lot of similarities in some ways. But yeah, I've never done the Bundesarchive deep into it. I've done photo stuff and some stuff like that, and a little bit of the digitizations. And obviously I don't speak German, so it was a bit of a struggle, but I figured it out eventually. But it was very little, it wasn't very much. Hopefully, I know it's not a great answer, but that's the best I got at the moment. Yeah, it's just Canadians aren't involved, right? There's Canadians aren't in combat. There's no Canadian units in combat, right? So other than some of the peacekeeping stuff, but yeah, the Canadian involvement, it's not like the South Koreans or anything, right? There's just nothing there. Because it was a huge political hot potato at the time in Canada for all kinds of reasons, mostly anti-Americanism, to be honest. But yeah, there was a lot of that going on, and the government at the time as well, especially when Trudeau came in. He really put the kibosh on anything like that. Ever consider any parallels and differences when comparing all the time? There's a lot. A lot of things are similar, depending, right? A lot of differences, though, right? Like massive differences in terms of how language is handled, how, all that stuff, right? Because you don't see that in the US, right? The other languages are there. I'm not denying that they're not there, but they kind of just get crushed by the weight of English speakers. The Quebecers, they tried to do that to the French Canadians. It didn't work. There's too many of them. They literally tried to just outbreed them and make them go away. That's why the two Canadian provinces of Upper and Lower Canada were united into the province of Canada. So when people say Canada starts in 1867, technically that's incorrect. This is later. It starts earlier, in the 1840s, after the rebellions in 1837, 38, which are a fascinating time period all on their own. tinged with republicanism, and there's Americans involved, and it's pretty wild. But yeah, it's just there's so many differences and so many parallels. I don't know what you pick. I mean, some things are so similar, and some things are so different, and that's just my experience with the United States at all. Right, we have the same stores a lot of the time and the same products, but then culturally things are so different. It's so funny to see the differences. So yeah, I mean, there's lots, and it's a hard comparison to do because I mean the numbers alone are just so much. There's so much disparity through the history of both. Like it's not even close, right? Even by the time the American Revolution comes around, English, the 13 colonies dwarf anything else in British North America or British America, I guess. So it's just wild the differences in that regard. So it's hard to parallel, and Canadian-U.S. relations has been studied to death, and then some. And we always usually come out on the short end of things because there's not much we can do about it. But the big one to me is numbers, because it's just hard to deny it. Well, I know it doesn't really answer, but there's so many things to look at. Yeah, I mean, we did one. Sorry, have you ever considered a live stream about the Spanish Civil War? This was from Alex Bowers. Yeah, 1600. Yeah, they're all named on the Mac Paps Memorial here in Ottawa, which is really cool. Yeah, okay, I don't know him personally, so maybe I can get in touch. I had Tyler Wetzel on years ago now about his book. It was more about the individual who was the commander of the Mac Paps, who were the leaders of the rebellion in the 1830s. That's where the name comes from. The Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, which actually had more Americans in it, I think, at one point than Canadians, or something like that. The numbers were not static. They changed a lot, as these units tend to do, especially in the international brigades in Spain, which is a crazy story. But yeah, I could look into that for sure. It's something I want to do. It's just not my area of expertise, and there's not much on it, unfortunately, and not a ton. I mean, they have a memorial and stuff like that, but it doesn't get all that kind of attention. And of course, the anti-communism plays into that still, which to me is a little silly. But yeah, it's a fascinating area, and set up legislation for today, actually, about fighting in foreign armies, which is interesting. So it has an impact on today. Question from Judith. My grandpa was a bat. Would my grandpa have had a batman while training in Canada? If yes, would he have followed him to England, or would he have been a British batman? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Because I'm just thinking about your grandfather's specific details of what I'm remembering, because he's at one of the training centers, right? I don't think so. I don't think that really comes until they. I don't know now, because maybe when they get assigned to the regiment. But then that's hard to say because of your can loan, right? So my gut, again, this is a guess, would be no, he would not follow him. My gut says no in Canada having a batman, period, because I don't think they had them at the officer training center. I don't know about that early, though. It's hard to say, but it wouldn't have been like a Canadian would not have followed him into a British unit. That was the whole point, right? Is that the Canadian surplus of manpower was in the officers. I mean, until it wasn't, and when the Canadian government regretted doing can loan. And I went to their ceremony on the Remembrance Day, which was really good. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked into the officer training in a long time. I read Dan Byer's book on this about conscription, because he goes into the early training, but it's obviously not really about the officers. There's some books on officers or the training of officers. I just haven't read them in years. I don't remember off the top of my head, but my gut says no Canadian's going to follow him to Britain to be part of a British unit. That doesn't really make much sense, because the Canadian manpower, again, was having issues, sort of, even early in the war, kind of, not actually, but they think they did. So it doesn't make sense for them to ship a Canadian overseas when the Brits can provide that when it's a British unit. Yeah, I mean, that's a start. Yeah, you're gonna have to get someone who can. Yeah, I think we mentioned Victoria Taylor. Yeah, she knows the German stuff. So, anyone who has had done German stuff before could probably help you if you just shoot them a message or an email or something. Off the top of my head, I don't really know because I haven't done that level of detail of digging in German archives, unfortunately. That's a good question. How were soldiers paid during the war? Not great. Again, that's all relative, right? They're paid more than, relatively, they're paid more than the Brits, but they're paid less than the Americans. So I just know when, and these are just some examples, right? Like when the Canadians show up in Hong Kong, they can outspend the Brits. So they're more popular with a certain portion of Hong Kong society because they can spend more. But then if there's ever a mix between Canadians and Americans, say like in Newfoundland, right, at the time, which is not Canada. It's in Tim Cook's latest book that we did the live stream about. Talks about Newfoundland quite a bit. I think very well done too. It's not ever usually covered in that sense. You get the naval stuff, but you don't get the behind the scenes stuff. The Americans could outspend the Canadians. So relatively speaking, the Canadians are doing okay, but as comparison to Canadian civilian society, they're underpaid. Staying home and working at a factory would have paid you a lot more than being a private. It wasn't very much at all. Not really opportunities to, well, there was opportunities to save, but you know how soldiers can be. There was things like war bonds and savings loans and things like that. So that could help. I've been doing a lot of research on the Hong Kong guys. So for the Hong Kong Veterans Association, so I'm going through the soldiers who unfortunately were killed either in the battle or as POWs. And a fair number of them do the war bonds. So the family gets that money eventually. There's some savings bonds, things like that. It's not much. Biggest ones I saw were like $50, which is a good chunk of change at the time. But again, a war worker is going to make a lot more money than a Canadian soldier. So no, not really too much money in the bank. But that said, those who did come home and were not, completely emotionally or physically unable to do so could work in these opportunities because the Canadian economy was much more better managed than after the First World War. And the opportunities were almost boundless. As long as you were basically white, you were good to go. Even for the Francophones, it was better. Still some other challenges there. If you're a white English speaker in the country, which was most of the Canadian Army anyway, there was tons of opportunities when they came back to make bank. And a lot of them did. A lot of people did well for themselves after the war. So no, I wouldn't say it's like there's tons of cash waiting for them when they come back. It's not like they could save up. A lot of them just didn't anyway. Just depending on leaves and things like that because they were so sporadic and you're young and you think you're going to die anyway. So why not? Relatively speaking, it depends, but in comparison to Canada at home, not so good, unfortunately. Oh, geez. Yeah. It's complicated. Canadian conscription. So Canadian conscription starts, I can give like a brief overview. So Canadian conscription starts in June 1940, like I said earlier, after the fall of France. It starts immediately. Like they put that legislation through in the blink of an eye because there's so much panic. But it's only for home service. So that just means Canadian proper. At the time, that just meant Canada. And I think Newfoundland was initially included as well. I could be wrong. If not, it was quickly added. Newfoundland was quickly added because they transferred all kinds of units into Newfoundland to do garrison duty. I mean, a lot of them went through Gander and St. John's and things like that. So that lasts for a couple of years. There's a plebiscite, right, which we know is a non-binding vote. Because King initially had said, we're not going to use conscripts overseas. So they had a plebiscite in 42, can't remember the month, to say, will you release the Canadian government for its promise to not send conscripts overseas? And this is obviously before Italy and Normandy, so there's no major combat going on for the Canadian Army. There's Dieppe, as we know. But there's no drain on manpower yet in that regard. So that is an overwhelming yes. The Canadian population overwhelmingly votes yes. I think it's 80+%. with French Canadians predominantly in Quebec voting no. Quebec votes no, again, like something like 70-80% no. Whereas the rest of the country, it's like 80% yes or something like that. The numbers are quite telling. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's you can tell which way the areas are leaning based on that. So that just kind of sits there for a while. They, like we talked about, they send conscripts to places like Kiska and the Aleutian Islands. Luckily, there's no combat. There's just some booby traps, kill some guys, unfortunately for them and their families. But there's no open combat. So the Canadian conscripts are not, getting slaughtered on some pebbly beach in the middle of nowhere, luckily. So that kind of just goes on. As we know, Italy starts in July, Sicily, and then they move through. So the manpower issues aren't really coming to head because of Italy. They don't even come ahead in Normandy, to be honest. They're having some issues with allocations, but it's not a numbers issue yet. That doesn't really come until later, where it becomes a real problem is after the Schelde, or towards the end of the Schelde, right? So basically this time period now, or in October 44 is when it really starts to get bad, because they can't get enough people in, because they had allocated way more troops to things like anti-aircraft and things like that, because they took a high number of casualties in places like Italy and North Africa. So the Canadian Army used those numbers to determine where people should go. So they had to remuster these guys as infantry to fill those holes, which they did a good number of. But then by the end of the Schelde, it wasn't enough. So they had to bring conscripts overseas. I think it's 16,000 are promised to go overseas. I think only around 11,000 are shipped. I can't remember. It's talked in most Canadian books on general books on the war. You can find it pretty easy, probably even online. But yeah, by 44, end of 44, there are Canadian conscripts overseas, but it's not as big as a violent, literally, as an issue as it was in the First World War, right? Where Canadians are literally shooting at each other in the streets of Quebec City. That happened. That didn't happen in the Second World War. So that's a really brief overview, missing a whole bunch of context for all kinds of things, like local concerns in Quebec, military concerns. And not the way you would think, because most of these conscripts had been conscripted since 1940. Initially, they're only supposed to train for 30 days and then, be ready for militia duty if it comes to that. They eventually just keep extending it until it's for the duration. So some of these guys are well trained, way better trained than some of the volunteers, like not even close. Like some of these conscripts have been training for years and years and years and years, whereas a volunteer can sign up in late 43 and can be fighting in Normandy. And not quite the same level. So it's just a really interesting parallel that doesn't get talked about too much, because I found very little, hardly anything of anyone disparaging the conscripts once they're in combat at all. And there's always so many factors of why someone gets conscripted and might be okay with it. I mean, I can only speak from my own family, but and this is a different war, First World War. My great-grandfather was, I think, the only son on the farm. He had a brother. I don't know what happened to him. I can't find any details. It says he moved to the U.S. After that, I don't know what happened. But anyway, he was the only, working age male left on the farm other than his father, so my great-grandfather. So he held on and all the way through all the deferments and everything until they removed the farming conscription deferment. And he was conscripted right away. So, there's reasons why people don't get conscripted. People are okay with getting conscripted when it eventually happens. It's a very complicated issue, particularly in Canada. It's not quite the same as it is in other countries. When I'm thinking the British or even the French context, or even the American context, it's quite different. And yeah, we don't have it anymore. It's gone. It was only for the war, and it hasn't been used since. I know that's very brief, but hopefully that kind of gives you some information. There's been some books on conscription. They're very academic, though. They're somewhat impenetrable, but not too bad. Jack Granstein wrote one. I think it's pretty good, but it's older now. I think he wrote it a long time ago. But it covers the political issues. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And then Dan Byer's book on it, Zombie Army, he looks at conscripts, overall training, all that good stuff. So it's a really good book, too. In kilometers, yeah, because everyone uses the metric system. We used the imperial up until the early 70s. Yeah, we just changed over like everybody else started to do. Yeah, it's I don't know. I can kind of do both. America right next door. Yeah, people don't. Yeah, we kind of get forgotten in that stuff. Yeah, that's the true Canadian measurement is actually in time. You don't say it's 2 kilometers. You say how long it'll take you. Because 2 kilometers in the middle of the prairies take you no time. If you're trying to get across Toronto in rush hour, it could take an hour plus. So we use time, and we just all kind of know what that means. That's how we do it. Yeah, that'd be great, Alex. You can send me an email. That would be fantastic. Oh, geez. Do you know of a good guest who could speak? Not really. Great Canadian Migration, 1815, 1850. No, unfortunately, not really. Nothing comes to mind. I could look. I know the Americans have looked at this a lot closer. And the numbers aren't as big in Canada, but there's immigrants coming in, mostly from Britain. Not like US, where there's a ton of German immigrants coming in as well, or Polish, or the Baltics, all that kind of stuff. Canada is much more centralized, and the British Isles specifically, and that's on purpose. So yeah, it's not something I know, but I can think about it and maybe see if I can get something on that. Yeah, sorry, I know these are coming late, but they did. They had it since 1940. Yeah, I mean, maybe. I don't know. I've never really looked into this because it doesn't really come up. I mean, I don't see it in writings at all, which is interesting. But it makes sense because there's lots of things officers up until, the Second World War are still expected to pay, like mess fees and all that. They could bankrupt somebody if they don't come from a wealthy family because the fees were so high. I've read about that a bunch. Yeah, we had a live stream on with Matt Barrett about his book on that, right? Because some of the officers are stripped of rank because of financial issues, because of they do financial crimes like fraud and things like that. So we talked about that at length. So maybe there's some insights there, but it's interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah, imagine you can think you can outbreed the French. Well, yeah, that's what it was, right? Revenge of the Cradle. There's documents of sermons and Quebec churches is saying we have to outbreed the English to survive. I know my family did their part to keep that going. Yeah, the U.S. one is 1870s, right? The Transcontinental Canadian Railway the Pacific Canadian Railway isn't open fully until, it's after the Northwest Resistance, so that's 1885. So it's after that. So yeah, it's much later, much later. I won't remember the date off the top of my head, but it's after that because the line runs out. That's actually part of the reason we talked about it with Dave Gripstad the other day. Complicated part of this as well, big part of it, and why Canada becomes the way Canada becomes Canada is because of the railway. Yeah, a lot of French immigrants, French Canadian immigrants, sorry, to Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts as well. Lowell had a huge French, maybe still does, French Canadian population working in factories, things like that. The pulp mills and textiles, I believe, was a massive draw for people because the economic opportunities in Quebec, especially pre-1940, are terrible for the average person. That's how my family ends up in Ontario, is because there's just no opportunities. So they have to leave for pay. The rest is history, as they say. But yeah, it was massive. A lot of people moved. Some went back, some never did. No, the pay was not suspended or cut. Obviously, they didn't get it. They weren't being paid. It wasn't a paymaster or anything like that. But no, I've seen the documents. They're paid in regular, count as overseas. In the Canadian context, it's counted as overseas pay, which is more. It just accrues just like any other pay, and all that comes with it. Canada did things like the top ups for the family, the war gratuity, war service gratuity, I believe is its official name in Canada. Things like that. It's like a dependence allowance. That also goes on, but they don't usually get it until after the war, and because they didn't, especially if they were the Hong Kong guys or sometimes even with the RCAF guys, you don't know what necessarily happened to them. So you can't really do it. Some of them, they did know what happened, or they got details like, say, they think they were a POW and then they were actually killed in battle, but they didn't know about it until months later. They would pay up until the point they were found dead or confirmed dead. So yeah, it's all on an individual basis, but no, they don't cut the pay, or didn't cut the pay. Oh, geez. Geez. That, well, I have no idea. Library and Archives Canada is a place to start. I know where they did it. I know where they did it is downtown. Don't know too much. I'm sure most of those files would be declassified. I can't say for sure, but Library and Archives Canada is the place to start. If it's anywhere, it's there. It won't be anywhere else. You can use their online search database and see what you can come up with. Yeah, because that's where everything is. That's where it's supposed to be anyway, especially that long ago. But they still keep things like some of that stuff restricted for stupid reason. Folks, I get his biography or autobiography, which is just a pile of those. Not a fan. I'm not a fan of Vokes. I think he was very much over promoted. He should never even have left, I think, battalion command. He was way over promoted for all kinds of reasons, right? Connected to people moving around and who else are you going to use and all that kind of stuff. He was a terrible tactician, in my opinion. And if it's just once, like, say, I mean, I got a video on Ortona coming. It's not going to be like all of it because I just only was able to see the town and I have an idea of how I want to present it. But things that like the gully before Ortona, it's literally, that's all it's called. It's just called the gully. He's making stupid decisions of just feeding in battalions, which he later ends up doing at the Huckwell Gap. Instead of feeding in battalions, he's feeding in divisions. So, like, he just makes the same mistakes over and over again. He doesn't seem to learn from his mistakes, which I get can be an issue, and bad maps and blah, 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 blah. I get it. But also the things he does later also have really soured my opinion on him. I used to think he was but then he did biography and how he justifies things like the Kurt Meyer decision and then saying people aren't going to care later on. He literally says that. I can't reach the book, but I plan to do maybe something with that at some point. But he says like people aren't going to care about that. We're moved past that. And it's just like this guy seems like not much going on upstairs. He didn't seem like the smartest guy. Didn't seem to learn any lessons. He should have just stayed a battalion commander, in my opinion. The fact that he was promoted to overall command of Canadian forces, it's just in Germany is just bonkers. But he was who was left, right? This Hofmeister had left to go for the Pacific Force. So I don't know. I just don't think he should have been promoted the way he was. But there was a whole series of events, right? With I think it's Salmon dying, and then there's a domino effect from there. So people have to be shifted around. That usually comes through Norma's favorite guy, Simmons. It's with him getting promoted is where this all sort of comes from. But yeah, not a fan. Oh, that's a good question, Andreas. When and where did the first Canadian soldiers set foot in Germany in World War II? Oh, I should know this. The area around Nijmegen, that, the crazy border there, because there was like chunks of the river that, because it's windy and crazy looking, like that were like cut off from the German front line that were technically like German territory. It's in the official history, actually, I think. Because they go to like, I think it's Goring's aunt's house or something like that. Her house is in that area, maybe near Emmerich. I can't remember exactly. But, the way the front line works out, it doesn't follow the border because the geography doesn't really stick with the border. So in that area, it's wild. And your cell phone goes off in today's world because you can cross the border at will and just keep pinging if you're not from there, which I thought was funny. But yeah, it's in there. It's in the official history. They talk about this, like it's her house or something, and then they do a ceremony on like we're finally in German soil, and then they leave to go back to the front line. So that would have been late 44, maybe around this time. I don't know. I could check after, but if anybody can pull up the official victory campaign online, I could check that out. They talk about it. It's I'm pretty sure it's in there. Yeah, I think I did an OTD post on it years ago, but yeah, it would have been that area. Canada has conscription in the First World War as of late 1917, and it nearly tears the country to pieces. Oh, it stopped. Oh, it was completed in 1885. Yeah, but the rebellion was over by that point. So. No, Norma, I have not heard how he is doing. I saw he's on LinkedIn the other day, but not much else. Yeah, that happens. Some guys killed themselves because they couldn't go. That happened in Canada, the US. It's complicated. Very, very complicated. Okay, yeah, Norma, can you email me about that? That way I'll have it. I remember stuff if I have something to refer back to, because I have to go to the War Museum soon. I got some stuff to do. So they should have a copy. They usually always have a copy. Mine's around here somewhere. I don't know where I put it. But yes, I can do that. Just email me. You are welcome. Yeah, I mean, we usually have that issue too, but that's why it can change, right? The numbers can change. Yeah, it's an interesting story of why they're called that. So, all right, people knew of zombies back then. It comes from the voodoo meaning of the term. So it's not the early 21st century version, Walking Dead, or what's the other one, 28 Days Later or whatever. It's not those zombies. It's they're brought from the dead and do whatever you want, like you were in command of them. So it's a derogatory term used against the conscripts, which they kind of embrace in a way, as sometimes these terms end up being. They kind of embrace that. So it's meant to be derogatory. They don't list. They just do what they're told, and they're automatons, and that's it, because they didn't enlist. They just do as told, which was an issue at the time, right? There was a lot of division on that, but nothing as big as it was in the First World War. Doesn't come to quite that level, but there's kind of all kinds of things going on, and coercion to make, as they said, the conscripts go active, because they trained the volunteers and the conscripts together eventually. So that caused all kinds of issues, trying to get these conscripts to go active, like making them do more fatigues, and sometimes physical violence was literally used, or not giving them weekend passes, only giving them to the volunteers, that kind of thing. So it was kind of nasty, and not a part of the war that gets talked about too much. And you can, as if you have the service record, you can tell if someone was a conscript and then went active. It's all in there, and the forms are different, so you can tell who was what at the time. It's really fascinating to me. Good question, Joe. What did Canada send to Russia? Tanks. A lot of, the Valentines, right? There's one in the. Oh, thanks, Ben. Sorry, I'm gone, but thanks for coming. So yeah, tanks, the Valentines, right? They sent a few of those, like 50 or something. I think it's 50. One got returned, right? It fell into a Ukrainian swamp. They plucked it back out in the early 90s and sent it back here to the War Museum. The crew got out. That's why you can laugh about it. I think it's really, really interesting story. Yeah, all kinds of small arms, blankets, clothing, all that kind of stuff. And no, Canada is never technically part of Lend-Lease, technically, as it fits that U.S. legislation definition in that way. Canada does not receive Lend-Lease. Canada is part of Lend-Lease in the sense that Canada's stuff can be counted as Lend-Lease. It's complicated. It's confusing. It's also in Tim's book. He covers this very well. In Tim's new book, Tim Cook's new book, about this, because it's just so many layers. Canada technically is doing its own thing, but Canadian stuff can be counted as Lend-Lease, because if it wasn't, right, then why would the Brits come and place orders in Canada if they could just get it, what ends up being pretty much free based on how much they end up paying back to the Americans, right? What's the point? Why would they do that? And the Canadian economy would have collapsed, right? Because this is well before Pearl Harbor as well. So, you know, the Canadian economy had recovered from the Great Depression, which hit it very hard because of the war orders. So if that all of a sudden collapsed again, it probably would have been worse. So they make agreements and things like that, and then they integrate and stuff like that. So they're sending stuff to Russia. Canada is a huge part of getting planes to Russia. They take what's the Northwest Staging Route, as it's called, work their way up from Montana across and to Alaska, and then the Russians fly them over. Canada is a major part of that. That's where the Alaska Highway comes from. So Canada's in this weird spot in Lend-Lease, not technically receiving Lend-Lease, but providing Lend-Lease at the same time, in a way. And there's all kinds of financial agreements worked out, and how it's dealt with, and things are paid for. There's mutual aid between the two sides as well, so that's part of this. It's basically one of these, okay, we'll write something down and we'll figure it out after. They do a lot of that, and then they just kind of figure it out. But Canada mostly just paid for stuff in the U.S. Canada made a lot of stuff. I always like to tell that is Canada made a ton of stuff in the war. I mean, I know Germany is producing everything. I get that. And Canada's not making things like tanks and bigger artillery. They're making field pieces, though. Canada outproduces all the Axis combined with units and things made by far. So, I mean, it's just fascinating to me that the Allies are, and like that doesn't, and they're fourth in the production of the Allies. So, like, I just use that as the bigger point of what were the Axis thinking, like taking on all these powers at the same time. You're going to get just outproduced and all that. So Canada is part of this, is part of that web, and it's complicated. And I'm not an economic historian, so I have trouble piecing it all together and then pulling it back apart and then putting it back together again in my own head. I did a video on this if you want to check that out, about funding the war and stuff. I was able to make some sense of it in that one. Yes, Jack Kerouac's French-Canadian descendant. Sorry, I'm trying to catch up. Technically, yes. They are Acadians who are from what is now New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, sent down there. Just get rid of them. And the people around New Orleans didn't want them, so they threw them in the swamps. Lovely. Yes, there was something similar to the GI Bill in Canada. So it's called the Veterans Bill of Rights. It's a series of legislation. It's not just one, bill act. It's a series of things. There was things like schooling was provided, you could get a loan at almost no interest at all, very generous terms for a house or a farm, and the equipment necessary and the land and all that stuff. So that was a huge part of it. Healthcare became a huge thing, right? Because healthcare, we're thought of as the free healthcare country. It's not, at the time, it's not paid for. Sorry, it's not, you have to pay for your own healthcare. So that gets covered as well. In a lot of cases, depending on what issues you have, this is one of the things where I think they dropped the ball on the Hong Kong guys because they weren't ready to help them with the issues they had, and they didn't really try. But anyway, yeah, so there's things like that. It's an equivalent. It's basically the same thing. And it actually helps the Liberals win the election again in the end of the war. So, because King's the only one who finishes, the only one who starts and finishes the war as the leader, largely because of the social programming that comes from the Veterans Bill of Rights. And there's a plaque about this right down the street from the archive, like a 1 minute walk, because that's where the buildings were for Veterans Affairs. Not anymore. They're renovating them, and it's loud all the time. HMCS Bytown. Yeah, that's like the stone frigate. So I don't know. Maybe I would dig into the the Library and Archives Canada website and see what you can find. Yeah, this is about Vokes. Yeah, I couldn't remember if he was permanent force, but that's the reason why he was promoted, because of that reason. Well, that's a good question. Yeah, yes. Let me check. This is something I need to look up. I mean, it becomes, I don't think it's the size it is at the time. Still using it, right? It's massive. It's huge. Sorry, I'm just reading really quickly. Yeah, no, it doesn't come in until 58. I was going to say, I don't think so. Yeah, it's a Cold War thing. Because out east is mostly Aldershot and Yarmouth, or is that the air training plan? Sorry, I get the bases like mixed up in my head. No, Gagetown is not using the Second World War at all. Yeah, because they're using Meaford for tanks in Ontario. Petawawa and Valcartier are the big ones still at the time. Yeah. Yeah. So no, Gagetown doesn't come around until later. The swamp. Nobody likes. Yeah, salmon. Yeah, it was salmon. Yeah, these things are all in my head. Operation Varsity. Sorry, I don't know what this is for. You guys get so far ahead of me. Yes, Operation Varsity. You mean like cover it? You mean? I've done a little bit, but not enough. Let me know again. Norma. First Americans were September 10th. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, in the Canadian Forces, yeah, it would have been near or British near Wilmshaven. They were pushing there as well. Yeah, battle engineer. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, they were pushing their way up there. That was the overall first Canadian Army objective at the end of April when the war was basically over. No, I have not. I've never been to Fort Ticonderoga or I've never been to really upstate New York at all. I mean, I've driven through it to go to New York City, but no, I've never really done like upstate New York. It would be cool to see though. But yeah, I mean, I've been to like Buffalo, but no, not that part. Always wanted to, and the Hudson Valley as well, on the list, I guess. Well, that would be nice. Heard lots of good things about Saratoga. I was more than 1,000. Yeah, Chris would know. I forgot Chris was here. Chris would know. There you go. That's a lot. I mean, because they weren't really using them other than at all, I don't think. Especially towards the end. I don't think the Canadians were using them at all. Well, that would be cool to see a reenactment there. Because I don't think it's changed from the time period, right? Like, because some of the other forts have like changed, but I don't think Ticonderoga did. Yeah, it's pretty tiny. That's always something I've wondered. One second here. So that's interesting, right? Because American conscription is massive, right? Like I never hear, and I know why, because conscripts are usually generally treated poorly. Because you always hear stories of Americans, right? You know, I joined up after Pearl Harbor. I joined up just before Pearl Harbor. They never say how they joined up. Some volunteer, but some people have to have been conscripted. I just never hear it. It's never said that way in the U.S. It can't all be volunteers. It's not possible because they start conscription before Pearl Harbor. It's just something I noticed. Maybe I'm just not listening to the right sources, but I think it's fascinating. It never comes up. I mean, it doesn't come from Canada either, but there's a lot less of them. Yes. Third largest Navy by hull number, I believe, and fourth largest Air Force by number of planes. Yes, it does. It starts technically in 42. Carleton, sorry, this is the other university in Ottawa. There's University of Ottawa. Ottawa University. No, Ottawa. University of Ottawa. Jeez. Yes, it starts because of that. And it expands massively because of that. Kind of, sort of. not really. Like, there's not a plan in place to do that. It's just the way things develop. Like, there was the idea of sending NCOs and officers, a handful at most, to North Africa, right after Torch, to get some training to use that for Italy, and then also plan was then to take those units that were fighting in Italy, take them back to England, and then they would fight in Northwest Europe, training the other ones who were not there, sharing that experience, which, as we know, never happens. So, I mean, yeah, in individual cases, yes, guys get basically demoted from various commands and get sent to do training because they're just better administrators than they are combat leaders. So no, it's not like a plan in place or something that they did. It was more of a rotation for leave. Some guys have been overseas for 5 years at some points, so they got to go home for a little bit. But no, there's no major plan in place, especially towards the end of the war. They just basically stop recruiting because they don't need them. Yeah, it was just not something that was really needed by the end, which is, again, makes this conscription thing so interesting. It just all sort of shuts down because they just don't need them anymore because the victory happens, I think, faster than they were anticipating. Oh yeah, like that's the plan, right? Like that was the idea with Gagetown. It was to have massive, basically divisional, multiple corps level exercises. I don't think it's seen one in a very long time, but yeah. Yeah, that's a good one to take a peek at for McNaughton. He's an interesting figure for so many reasons. Oh, yeah, varsity. No, Canadians are technically in Germany before varsity. Well before. Okay, sorry, I was just reading that. Andres. Is there a good book about Canadian Army in England from outbreak of World War II until Dieppe or Sicily? Not really. You have your general ones. You have your official histories. You have Tim Cook's various books. I don't think... Oh, no, I'm just thinking out loud. I don't think many people have written on it in book format. I'm thinking of a few dissertations I know, both at master's and the PhD level, that look at training. So that would also go past, either of those. But it's always like the opening chapters. It's never looked at separately. I don't know if it needs to be looked at separately because Dieppe obviously has a psychological impact on the Canadian Army in different ways. Pre-Dieppe, it has an impact, and then post-Dieppe, obviously, it has an impact. Decimates a division, almost literally, almost. So obviously, there's practical impact there for the 2nd Division, but I don't know. I don't know if it needs its own book. I mean, someone may be thinking about it. I can only think of dissertations. Because not a lot of people are looking at Canadian Army training, period, at all. Really at all. I mean, I was struggling for my own dissertation to find stuff. Because that's what one of my chapters was looking at the battalions that were sent. Because it's a massive controversy. They were not supposed to be sent because of the system they had developed. If they're ready to go, not ready to go, needing refresher training, blah, blah, blah. And how they ranked it, even though it's not really a rank. So there's a lot of misunderstanding with that. So I had to do that fresh, basically. That's one of my chapters because it just isn't too much on it because it's the whole thing. So no one's really looking at, September 39 onwards and then stopping before Normandy or Italy. Nobody does that. Everyone always takes it through. I could be wrong, but off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. Yes, I knew they were collapsed or whatever. But yeah, that's cool. That would be cool to see them. There isn't one. Canada doesn't have an equivalent to Pearl Harbor. You have losses and you have shock. You have Dieppe, you have Hong Kong. Those are somewhat localized. Hong Kong is very localized in Eastern Canada and Winnipeg. Dieppe is kind of spread out. It's one division and then some. But no, there's no Pearl Harbor moment, right? Canada is part of that slow march to war. Canada technically was not needing to follow Britain, but Canada was going to follow Britain no matter what. They were going to do it. The king had no choice. He was going to war whether he wanted to or not. So no, it's not. There's no equivalent. Canada doesn't have an equivalent. There's no shock that brings Canada into the war, because Canada's at the war from the beginning. I guess the invasion of Poland, but it's not on the same level as Pearl Harbor, especially with the whole, racial anger towards the Japanese. I mean, there's a little bit of that in Canada, no denying that, but they're already at war, so it just add to the heap of angry. There's no real equivalent. That's a good question. So that's very late, some of them. Really, really late, like late 30s, they're still riding horses. Some of them get transferred to motorcycles because that's all they had. And then they eventually get moved to armor. I'm thinking, which unit did that? Really, really late. I can't remember. One of the ones that went to Italy? Because there's just not that many of them, right? I can't remember off the top of my head. 711 Hussars, maybe? Anyway, they were using horses up until like 39, like early 39, especially when the war clouds start to really come in. They switch. But yeah, some of the militia was still using horses. Luckily, it didn't stay that way for the combat they saw. But yeah, it's really late. Really, really late. Yeah, I mean that's part of it. They were sick and tired of training. There was issues with that. Sorry, I see Pat's coming with the RCMP. I'll get there in a second. Well, that's an issue, right? Like that's why I said DF has multiple impacts, and including before, right? Because you have what's termed Operation Rudder, which is what gets canceled, right? Because the part of the convoy gets spotted. They're not really sure if they got spotted or not. So the whole thing is kiboshed, canceled. And then they redo it again later as Operation Jubilee. It's the same plan. It's identical. So there's accounts. Again, I don't know how true they are or if they come from much later. I don't remember off the top of my head. But some of the soldiers coming off the boats after Rudder is canceled are crying because they're so upset that they're not going. I mean, I'm sure they changed their tune after Jubilee goes ahead. But, they're pissed off that they're not getting a chance because they're getting called lazy and incompetent and all this kind of stuff by various groups, especially in Canada, for political reasons mostly. So they're not taking that too well, and they're not happy about it. This is why Canada volunteers to be part of DF. This is why Canada volunteers to be part of Sicily, right? First Division is not as part of the original order of battle for Operation Husky, right? Canada talks its way into it because they're just kind of not just sitting there, they're doing things, but it's the same thing over and over again. And they're tired of it. So that's why they get into the fight. And it has its own ripple effects, right? It causes issues in England and drunkenness. And not crazy, going AWOL kind of things, but a lot of guys have that on their record. I've seen the records. I mean, they've been there. It's nothing major. It's usually like they just probably passed out somewhere drunk for the night or, had a night visit with someone. I don't want to say anything other than that and get demonetized or banned. There's things like that. There's a lot of, disappears for the night and gets docked a couple days pay or confined to barracks and things like that. But other things happen. It's not all sunshine and roses either. So yeah, you're right. They did. They got tired of it. Yes, technically we still do have it because of the RCMP, which is Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But they're like a paramilitary force that does policing across the country. Unless that province has a provincial force like Ontario and Quebec, then they do less. But other provinces, they don't have that, so they use the RCMP. It's another thing we do. We make things complicated. Was the Northwest Mounted Police that was set up to police what was then the Northwest, which started west of the Ontario border, basically, all the way to the Pacific. Yeah, well, that's Blackburn's whole thing, right? It's his whole service, so it's his view of things, right? It's like, yeah, it's great. I'm not disparaging the books at all. It's more his view than like a history. You know what I mean? So it's presented sometimes as like a history when it's not. right? It's Blackburn's experience, which is a valuable thing to have. I'm not doubting that. That's a good question, Jay. I don't know. It can't be very many. I mean, yeah, some get hit, some troop ships get hit, but it can't be many. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's probably not a lot. A couple hundred, maybe. I know one troop ship one off the top of my head, I'm thinking of went down, but it wasn't that many. So maybe less than 1,000. Because by the time they can move those guys faster. They can put them on the faster boats, so the U-boats really have trouble tracking them and keeping up with them because they're armed, right? So it doesn't happen too much, and there's not too many troop carriers in the convoys moving supplies, which are the slower convoys, right? The faster convoys were usually okay, unless they ran right into something or a wolf pack or something like that. It was the slow convoys that had the issue, and not a lot of troop ships are on the slow convoys. But there are so many of them, I can't say definitely. There's just so many convoys to keep track of. But yeah, it's probably not very many. I know some American ships get hit. But again, it's just a numbers thing. Bigger army, more numbers. Yeah. Yeah, the Osprey book is good. It's just pretty small. Yeah, they're like, I don't know if Pat answered it later, but yeah, they're like a ceremonial thing. You don't use the cavalry unit in its duties in the day-to-day, but yeah, they're it's ceremonial. They're here in Ottawa. They have a huge stable and area for the training and everything. Non-war, yeah, here we go. Are younger Canadians aware, puzzled by the former imperial links between Canada and UK? I don't know. That's a good question. I want to say no. I don't think they're puzzled by it, or like they're aware. It's hard. You can't not be aware of it because we have king now. King Charles III is a king of Canada in his own right. He's not king of Britain that also does Canada. It's a distinction that's important to those that find this to be important. Obviously it's symbolic, but the death, and that was huge news, and death of Queen Elizabeth and the coronation and everything. You couldn't not hear about it. It was everywhere, so we know about it, and the symbols are still everywhere here. Like, they are impossible not to see. Around the corner for me, we have a school that's literally called Queen Elizabeth. Every major city in Canada, I'm pretty sure, has one. Then there's prince ones, like London, Ontario has one, I think, after all the major princes up from the 20s onwards. Maybe all the Prince of Wales. It's hard not to. The roads have it. Ceremonial things have it. Government symbols have it. They don't call it. It used to be the Royal Mail in Canada too, until they changed that in the 60s, I think. It's just hard not to notice it. You have to really not be paying attention to not notice it. But I can't speak for like really, really younger kids. But it's you can't not. And we still play, the royal anthem. So Remembrance Day ceremonies, and schools always do them. So kids are going to be hearing it and are going to know the songs. So they'll learn about it. So yeah, I mean, it's not really anything that's a big deal here anymore, but that's just my opinion. Some people are into it more than others. So it's something that's an interesting part of Canada, and the core of what became Canada is obviously linked to all of that. And some people don't like that we still have those links. And even in the purely symbolic things like road names and statues and all that stuff, which I try not to get involved with because I don't think it really makes a difference at the end of the day. We should be focusing on other things, other problems we have in this country. But yes, I'm pretty sure it's hard not to be aware of that, especially if you're going through the Canadian education system. It's just taught as part of it. Oh, geez. Sorry, I'm not laughing at you, Rodrick. I'm laughing at the question. Not enough. Canadian Army, oh, geez, I don't know. Probably under 100K. Probably. I don't know. I checked a while back, but you never know if the numbers are up to date. And do you really want to publicize that? It's not big enough. The Canadian Armed Forces are not big enough. I'll answer your question indirectly. None of it is big enough. We don't fund it enough. It's not important enough. It doesn't have a priority for Canadians when it should, especially now with certain events that happened at the beginning of this month. We need to up our budgets. We need to up our size. We need to up everything, and we're not doing it. And I don't think we will until we have to, and then Canadians will die as a result. But that's the Canadian way of war, which I've said before. And yeah, so no, not big enough. That's how I'll answer that. But probably under 100K, maybe just over. It's not enough. And that might even be all of the military. I don't know off the top of my head. And then if you count reserves, it can get a little murky what the numbers are. Because again, we still have that system in place. So I don't know. I'm sure it's out there. Somebody can find it, but I'm sure it's out there. So no Canadians in North Africa. That is largely a British decision. King is not going to push for it. People in the cabinet, especially Ralston, when he becomes, sorry, I'm talking like these little nitty gritty details everybody knows. So J.L. Ralston was initially in the mid-20s under King, was Minister of Defense. He moves to finance in King's second round in the 30s, but then eventually becomes defense minister again. He's pushing for it because he's always pushing for Canadians to get more involved. He's pushing for conscription from the beginning, basically. He wants them to go, because I did this for my dissertation. This is why I know this. He wants them to go. King is not keen on it, and Churchill doesn't want them because the New Zealanders and the Australians had fought there. The Indian divisions were fighting there. South Africans are fighting there. The Axis are using it for propaganda purposes, right? You know, the British can't fight. They're using their colonies to fight for them. So imagine sending another division from another quote-unquote colony. It's not going to look very good. So they didn't. They waited and saved them basically for later. But especially after Torture, when things started to pick up pace. Not really necessary. But yeah, it was a combined decision, mostly British. Plus, it would have been a logistical pain to figure out because getting the Australians and the Indian units there was a pain to begin with. Oh yeah, any Corvette was terrible to serve on. Yeah, they're not meant for ocean going. So yeah, they're not meant for that. They're whalers, technically. So a whole other thing that they make them do ocean going service. Just the photos of them covered in ice are just absolutely wild. So 42. Yeah, the last Canadian charge is at Memorial Wood in 1918, March 1918. Flowerdew, Lieutenant Flowerdew is killed. He gets a Victoria Cross for it. He's literally riddled with bullets when they find his body because they're charging a German position to fill the line during the spring offensives. Yeah, and that's the last one in Canadian military history for now. Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised they tried, especially with the way the budgets were in the 80s. Surprised he even tried that. Yeah, they did. I don't know if they were like a charge, though. I think they were using them for movement. I don't know if it was open. Maybe just not sealed very well, if I'm remembering correctly, because the water didn't get in a lot. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just keeping going. Yes, that's part of Canada. You take the oath to the crown, not the political party. We don't do it to the Constitution either because we didn't get that until the 80s, technically. The Navy's even smaller than the Army. Yeah, it's not big enough. Not even close. It's tiny. Yeah, sorry. There's nothing. We're getting icebreakers for patrol reasons to go up to the north. I think for obvious reasons. Yeah. yeah, it's not just the answer again is just not enough. Too small, not adapted for what we need it to be. Yeah, bigger in the Cold War, then obviously went down in size as the Cold War dragged on. In a way, it led to that, and then after the wall came down, the budgets were slashed, and most of it went. Used to have aircraft carriers too, actually, that were Canadian, not like loaned or anything like that. They were Canadian aircraft carriers, but they haven't been around in a long, long time. Maggie and Magnificent, and called Maggie, and oh geez, I'm blanking on the other one. Someone will know. Maggie and someone will get it for me. Yeah. So there we go, under 100,000, which is just not even close to enough. That's wild. Authorized strength is 71.5. 30,000 reserve, and then the Ranger Patrol groups, which are in the northern part of Canada. For those who don't know, Rangers are part of the military. They're usually in indigenous communities in the far north, and they patrol. They're great. Nothing but respect for the Rangers. They do tough work. I was laughing because they do like catch all. They like care of people. It's great. Like people will get stuck in the snow, and they'll like help them get out, like people, and then they'll give them food and send them home. Like they're just such good people. It's amazing to hear these stories. Like I can't remember, some guy got stuck and they got him out and they sent him home with fish or something. It's hilarious that they're just, and they're all volunteers, and they're finally starting to, I think, get really good recognition. And they were standing guard, ceremonial guard at the War Memorial, and then more in the last couple of years, which is fantastic. And being, part of that and being shown to the public, which they weren't really before. So I think that really helps. Helps with that. So they're the small part, but they're an important part, I think, and to come, they're going to be very important. But yeah, we're tiny, and it's a problem. But we have a whole, and I've talked about this a lot, the view of the military in Canada is not good. Not just military history, but in general. It's not like an anti-war thing either. It's seen as unnecessary. It's an expenditure that we don't need because of our ally in the south, and we might not be able to rely on them anymore. So we used to rely on Britain, and now we rely on the US, and these are not good situations to be in for a sovereign country. So technically, no, they were not can loan. Can loan doesn't come until later. They were sent as temporary, not technically can loan. It was always supposed to be temporary. Can loan was not. That's why they couldn't get them back. The Canadian Army would have tried to get them back if they could have, the can loan guys, because they needed them by the end. There wasn't enough officers. But technically, like Strom Galloway, those guys are not can loan. It's a separate thing. They just set them on their own to be part of British units. Oh, I'm sure there is. I don't know. I don't know. Yes, I don't think it's intentional, but that ends up happening. That's what why they're part of this spear point of Normandy too, because Third Div was very well trained and had been doing it for so long. Why they're able to do what they're able to do, and then things like Sicily too. They're thrust into a role that they literally change as they hit the beaches, basically, or a couple days later. And they adapt because they're just trained for so long. People disparage the training, but they shouldn't, because the proof is in the pudding, as they say. And they did their jobs well. Yeah, King didn't want them because he didn't want them to be part of reviving the empire. I don't know, kind of like Roosevelt had that as this kind of part of his overarching strategies. Not helping the Brits retain the empire. King had that in a lot of ways too. Some parts he was okay with, some he wasn't. I'm sure racism plays a role in that. But he didn't want Canadians being used as a way to gain back Burma or things like that. So that's part of it too. I mean, that's probably just an excuse too, as King, or as Kevin says about King, is he wanted to avoid conscription. It kept him up at night, thinking conscription's coming and it's going to rip this country to pieces. I mean, it had, and he was paranoid that it was going to happen again, because it also ripped apart his beloved Liberal Party, which split in the First World War into the Union government, which is just basically the Conservatives. He was scared that was going to happen again between pro and anti-conscription elements. I mean, because we have his diary, you can see it. It's up all the time. Conscription comes up nonstop, the entire war, and he literally says for Hong Kong, as long as this doesn't lead to conscription, I'm okay with it. He literally said that. So I mean, it's the thing he just obsessed over, and I don't think that's off the mark. So it's only one division at the time that's fully equipped. Is the 1st Canadian Division is fully ready to go after Dunkirk in the immediate period anyway. Yeah, it's the only one that's ready to go right after Dunkirk. And I mean, like right after, like the their little ships are coming back. Icebreakers like global warming. No, not quite. The strong boats that rip the ice apart. I mean, we've always had them, but not enough of them. Not now. Oh, and Bonnie, yes. Maggie and Bonnie. Yeah. Yeah, I knew somebody would have it. Oh, yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah, it was a flying bridge. That's right. The Royal Canadian Navy, RCN. Yeah, I try not to look into that because it's just going to upset me and make me angry and know that we're screwed. Yeah. Sun works for Irving. Yeah, well, they get all the contracts, so that's good. Good for Irving. Oh, there's a few destroyers, but not enough. Definitely not enough. Yeah, Canlone is 43 because that's when it starts going, but well, that's well after North Africa, right? So that's not the same that those guys were sent to North Africa proper, like Tunisia and stuff like that. And they would be sent as observers as well in places like the Western Desert, but there's no program in place. Like Canlone was a program that comes later. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason. Definitely part of the reason of why Canada's Army, particularly, because the Navy and the Air Force are two different, animals in that regard of strategy. But that's definitely part of it. And also why the Canadian contribution in the Second World War for the Army perspective is not viewed the same. It's not the same as the First World War. It's not seen as glorious. It's not seen as victorious, even though it's arguably more victorious, I guess, in a way you could say. A lot more conquering, that's for sure, with the fighting in Germany. And the numbers they faced. And there's a whole Canadian Army, the 1st Canadian Army, which is mostly not Canadian, but, semantics. But yeah, the Canadian Corps has this reputation at the time, and still to this day, I don't think it's really changed, of being this, the shock troops, as they called it, and get the tough jobs done wherever they may be. So that was a big part of it, and how it was used and misused in a lot of ways, and has legacy issues. Yeah, it's wild that plays into it, and how that has had an impact all the way through to today. And I mean, Vimy is a big part of that, because we all lean into the Vimy myth over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah, they were, I would say, the training was fantastic. The field craft that these guys were learning was sometimes, it was above and beyond, basically. All kinds of things they're trained to do that aren't something that there's going to come up as line infantry later on, but they're ready for it. And it helps them, right? And they're in fantastic, physical shape as well, which you can't, discount as part of it. But yeah, it is fascinating to me, but of course I'm the military history nerd, so it's all going to be fascinating to me. But a lot of people just don't even talk about it. I mean, there's always a fascist movement because of the economic conditions. Not really. It's not very big. It's as far as I know, it's not very big. There is a movement, but it's nothing like the States. I don't think there's, you know, arenas selling out like you see in Madison Square Garden, right, in New York. But there's a fascist movement before and after as well, depending on how you want to define them. But nothing major. The issues are on other things. Canada kind of goes the other way, sort of ish, kind of. It's hard to say, right? Canadian politics are fast and loose with the definitions sometimes, and doesn't really fit into the boxes of other places. And parties change over time, and objectives change, and demographics will change, and because there was a farming party that morphs into what's called the CCF, Canadian Cooperative Federation, which becomes the NDP of today. So they're not always aiming at the same people, and it's not always made up of the same people. So it's more left-leaning a lot of the ways. There's a lot more communist, I would say, support in Canada than there was fascist support, right? Because you see that across basically the Western world. Both of those movements gained strength because of the Great Depression. But in Canada, I don't think there's as stark as a fascist movement. But I could be wrong. But as my understanding of it, it's more of a left-leaning thing. If you're going to use that sort of paradigm, it's more left than it is right in, you know, response to what's happening economically. Yeah, someone else did Welcome Causeway on there. Yeah, I mean, it does drive me crazy. It does. It drives me nuts that people say Canada has a short history. Because that's just not true. People have been in the Americas for how many tens of thousands of years? They think there's been some discoveries recently where it's maybe even longer than they thought. So to say that is just, yes, it's very colonial. It's very racist, straight up. That Canada somehow begins in 1867, which also makes no sense. Like I said earlier, the concept of a Western Canada, you know, Western, big W, in terms of the Western world, is even older than that. Literally politically older than that. So it drives me nuts when people say that, because they're just discounting a huge chunk of what made today Canada what it is. And it leads to all kinds of misunderstandings and all kinds of problems, which in this country we are still fighting over how to deal with that. And some people just want to stick their head in their sand, others don't. I'm on the side of we need to face the problems instead of just hoping they go away. But I don't get any power over anything. Yeah, they're fantastic, and you can like pick them up and do little. Sorry, I'm just checking. You can like pick them up and read them like episodically. You don't have to read them cover to cover, which is great. You can just read a chapter in a blow, which is pretty cool. Sorry, I don't know what that means. We're a little closer to near pair. Can somebody clarify what that means? Is that an idiom I don't understand? Yeah, 300 Canadians served in the British First Army, Tunisia's company commanders. Yeah, senior NCOs. Yeah. That's a good question. Oh, sorry, I closed it. Sorry, I'm just reading again. Future leaders, combat experience with the formal lessons learned. It's hard to say. I don't think so. Not in a big way. I mean, I've seen some documents of some lessons getting passed along. Whether they're read or not, I can't say, because just because the headquarters received it and stamped received and stamp said seen by commander doesn't mean they actually looked at it. That doesn't mean anything, as I've come to learn. So I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't really see it coming up much. I mean, you have ones like Sean Galloway who uses his personal experiences to help. Is it widespread? I'm going to say no, because the troops in Italy are not talking to the troops in Northwest Europe until they're literally combined together in the 1st Canadian Army very late. There's no real communication between the two. So I'm also not sure how much, as opposed to talking about modern Canadian military, the military at the time is much bigger. So 300 at the time isn't much, not much to do anything with. It's hard to, get 300 people to disseminate lessons to thousands. Right, hundreds of thousands. So it's a relative thing. But yeah, it's fascinating. You guys can ask me questions about anything. It doesn't just have to be history, even though that's what we love to do. Oh, thanks for coming out, James. Sorry, no, you're just probably gone now a while ago. Sorry. He was a unrepentant anti-Semite. That's up. What's up with that? He was a terrible person. That's pretty much it. He was just a terrible person. Yes, both. Canadians, just like the Brits, use both. Yeah, sometimes they're equipped with American weapons, like in the Aleutians, or First Special Service Force was American weapons, so fully. Some stuff was integrated, like the priest guns were used and things like that. So it's a mix. It's mostly British, because that's an agreement done amongst the British Commonwealth, even prior to the First World War, is to all use the same stuff. To make it easier to integrate the various forces together if an empire war were to come up, which happens twice. I mean, it destroys the empire, but they were planning that to happen, so they wanted to keep it integrated for that reason. Doug Delaney has an excellent book on that, and it's not just from the Canadian perspective either, even though he's Canadian and prof at RMC, Royal Military College in Kingston. It's about what's called the Empire Project. It's fantastic. I reviewed it years ago. It's a fantastic book. He explained it to me. The idea was like Lego, so everything can just snap into place and they go for it. So if your questions about that, that's a fantastic one. Yeah, it's academic because he's an academic, but it's still, I thought it was a great read, great book. And it kind of looks into that in a different way and why the things develop the way they do. Because they could just buy from the Americans, but they didn't. Yes, I have to get the fancy words in every now and again. I got to dust off the diploma. Yeah, that's putting it mildly. Favorite fascism, like the king before 36. Yeah. Oh, near peer. Sorry, I'm going back to your comment. Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it. Yeah, near peer. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Not now. Definitely not now. What's your second favorite color? I don't know. Red, I guess. I don't know. I don't really have a second favorite color. Yeah, Ford was a terrible human. Got richer, even more richer off the war, though, which is interesting. Maybe just play either side. Yeah, no questions at the moment. So if you want anything else, go ahead. We can shut down shortly. But yeah, I just want to say thank you to all the supporters of the channel. It means a lot to have the support of the patrons and the YouTube channel members. If you can support through Patreon, please do. It really does help to have a somewhat consistent income per month so I can plan and do more and know what the future will hold. Because without that, I can't. Without some stability, I can't really plan. I'm not planning anything right now for that exact reason. I don't know how it's going to go in the next little bit. So I'm not sure. So I'm not planning anything as of yet. If I can get a little more stable, I will. But that said, I don't know. So any support you can give is fantastic. To help keeping everything going means a lot. And to do this for a couple of years now is pretty cool. I didn't think it would get to this point. So I guess that's, money in the bank, as they say in that terms. If it does have to all end eventually soon, then so be it. But I'm trying to stop that from happening. If you can support, please consider doing so. That would mean a lot. All right. I'm just getting back to how did you find, Remembrance Day commemorations. Well, the rain really put a damper on a lot of it. I didn't go to the national ceremony purposely. I didn't want to. I've been to it many times. I'm not a big fan of how it's all politicized and takes forever to lay wreaths from every politician and group and blah, 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 blah. Just tired of it. So I went to the Cail one, which was great. And then by that time, I was talking to people by the time everything was done. So I didn't go to any others, but I walked around and checked out all the, the usual haunts and the memorials and things like that. But I'm just a bit over the whole national ceremony, to be honest. I'm going to aim for smaller ones from here on out, if I still can go to them from in the future. Third color, yeah, I definitely don't have any. Parts of it, I haven't read the whole, all three cover to cover. I've read the the Normandy stuff and the rest of the war as well, because I led a tour in Northwest, outside Nijmegen for, Veritable, because there's a story where he's using an old windmill, surprise, surprise, in the Netherlands. He's using an old windmill as an OP spot, for his regiment, because that was his job. And he figured, the Germans aren't going to shoot at it because they'll think nobody's that dumb to use it. So he used it, and it's still there. It survived the whole fighting and that whole, attritional period of the Nijmegen salient and everything like that. So I read that stuff because we went to the windmill. It's still there. It's in the grocery store. It's at a grocery store parking lot in the small part of Nijmegen. Forget the village. I think it's just all Nijmegen now. But it's really cool. You can go right there. And sometimes it's even open because they sell bread, so it's cool. But yeah, I read that volume pretty close, but I haven't done like cover to cover the whole three. Just haven't had the chance. Oh, thank you, David. I appreciate that. Bye. Well, bye, Norma. What Canadian authors cover World War II well? I would say it's done pretty well. I mean, there's always things that could be looked at better. I just wish our academic stuff got covered a little better. It's just the Canadian history departments are contracting instead of expanding. So I don't know. There's always something to be covered. I mean, obviously, I'm biased and want everything covered. So, but I think generally overall we're doing pretty good. Tim's done a fantastic job. Marcus Zilke's done a good job. We don't have the numbers like the Americans or the Brits to cover everything. So we don't have that. Yeah. Keep going. I can go for a little bit longer if you like. Prayer band. Well, technically there was no prayer band. That did not happen. No prayers have been banned from the ceremonies. And no, I don't think it has hurt attendance in the slightest. Good old hockey analogy. Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that in a second, but yeah. Oh, you're welcome, Judith. Because there's, I didn't know they were doing a ceremony. But there's a street there that you can park on that even during a business day. Is like you can park on it, which is pretty rare for that part of Ottawa. So I parked there, and then the memorial is on that side because I want to go to the Hong Kong one eventually. I didn't think I was going to just check out the Cail Memorial myself. I didn't know they were going to do a ceremony because I didn't know the association was still going. Apparently it is. So I'm going to get in contact with them and talk to them and see what's what. It was very well attended, actually. There was government representatives from Britain, and there's Canadian military there, obviously. There was Marines there, U.S. Marines. That was interesting. I don't know if they just came along or how that happened, but they were there. But yeah, so that was cool. So I don't know what the association is doing or if they do anything else or, they just keep in touch with each other. I'm not sure, but yeah, not too sure. Yeah. So again, I don't know. I think we've covered it all. People are signing off. So I'm not too sure about the future. We'll see. I'll keep probably the patrons and YouTube channel members updated first more than the general public because they're the supporters that are honestly the ones that keep all this going. Yeah. And Judah, of course, I'll let you know about it. Of course I will. I'll send them an email probably sometime next couple of days. Just I haven't had a chance. It's good to do this sort of work and I enjoy it, but it might not last. So just want to say thank you to everybody who supported the work by watching. Watching the videos is massively helpful. We can. So yeah, I keep trying to get this thing to kind of be stable on its own, but it's just not there. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So we shall see. So yeah, if you guys are not members yet, please do consider. Patreon is the best for me if you can. it's the best way to get the most out of that. And I can share the most on there as well, which is important for me because the YouTube memberships, they get more taken away by YouTube, but I also don't have the flexibility like I do on Patreon. On Patreon, I can share everything. I can share file formats, everything. YouTube, I can't. I can drop it in the Dropbox, but it's just not as easy to use. I don't like that. So I love Patreon for that reason too, because I get more flexibility. And I think it's better user-friendly. So yes, please consider that. If you're not, it would be really, really helpful to keep those numbers bumping up and going up a little bit. But yeah, anyway, everyone have a good rest of your Friday. You're just going to get off work, and I've been helping you avoid some work. We'll see. 1812. Sorry. I doubt it. They already did that. I doubt it. Oh, thank you, David. I appreciate that very much. Yeah, anything, a couple bucks. Even if you're not, you can give, well, I think it's $3.50 Canadian. To you Americans, that's like a nickel. So anyway, yeah, if you can, that'd be great. If you can help, please do. Other than that, we'll see what the future brings, and I got lots of thinking to do. So other than that, have a good weekend. See you, everybody.